So yeah, we got quite the day today. So obviously, we know who's up. Okay, he's great. So I do want to. Kevin and I have been buddies for a while. Kevin's one of those guys. Don't talk to him a ton, but every time we see each other, it's always great. It's always a great time. He's a guy I look up to. Read all of his stuff. I know you guys do too. There is one thing though, I do have to say that really does bug the shit out of me about him, and that's that he is so damn good looking that it's one of those things. It's like you look at him and you're like. So I just have to, step up my personality and things of that nature when I'm in the room with him, and we're good. So, Kevin Carr.
Hi. It's actually just relative. It's because you always see me with Brendan all the time. That's the only reason. So I'm excited to give this to you solely because it's brand new. And when I mean brand new, I mean I did this yesterday. And it's not because I leave things to the last moment. It's because Brendan actually gave my presentation that I was going to give yesterday and didn't tell me until he gave it. So, because I care about you guys so much, and I love you all so much, I said, well, I can't possibly just go up and mail it in and literally give the same lecture that Brendan took from me. So I made this for you guys, and I'm really excited about it because this is around a shorter topic that I've spoken about before, and I wanted to expand on it. So I look at it as a positive. Just gave me the motivation and the opportunity to expand on something I was really passionate about. So there you guys go. But if you want the slides from my other presentation, just look at Brendan's that he gave you guys. Okay, so anyways, I got really interested after last year. I gave a presentation called Movement is Medicine. And in that, I had asked people to kind of look a little bit deeper and think of themselves as more than just a fitness professional, right? The person who teaches fitness classes, or as your relatives might be like, oh, he or she is a personal trainer. They say, oh yeah, you're a personal trainer. What else do you do for a living, right? But I want you to think about positioning yourself more as a health practitioner, because what we do carries a lot more weight than I think we give ourselves credit, and definitely the people around us give us credit for. And I became really passionate, especially about looking into the research about fitness as it relates to cognitive health. Okay? So, whoa. I'm gonna blame this on Brendan too. This worked. This just worked, didn't we? Didn't we just do this?
Oh, you're moving now. You're moving a lot.
That worked. Especially too, because my grandfather died May 12th of last year from vascular dementia. And I'll tell you, there isn't really a disease that can cause more health through a family than seeing someone decline because of a cognitive disease. And my personal experience in firsthand was seeing dementia and seeing Alzheimer's, mainly because the person he was on the left, by the time he was the person on the right, and this was even still while I was like a senior in high school, right? They weren't the same person, right? Not just the stress that and hell that it brings upon the people who are actually going through it, but the people all the way around them. And that's true for all cognitive diseases, right? Especially because from the outside looking in, you don't necessarily see these things. And when I started to dig deeper into that research, you realize we always name a lot of these cognitive diseases as like old people problems or things that are kind of outside of our scope. But then when you look a little bit deeper, you realize this isn't an old person issue, right? Cognitive disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, all these things start years before the symptoms start to take place. And so long before he started to suffer, these were things from lifestyle modifications, lifestyle factors for him that had begun years and years and years prior to that. And the reason I became passionate about this is because so many of these modern diseases that we currently are fixated on trying to cure, we're looking at it from the wrong angle. You can't cure something that's reactionary when it came from a lifestyle issue. It's about precautions and planning ahead of time to set yourself up for success down the road. And I wanted to try to look at that and look at what we have the power to handle as health professionals. Okay? And it's fascinating because when you look at how fitness is marketed, right, you don't see a lot of gyms or fitness people promoting like, hey, training for brain health or training for cognitive health, right? And it's not really a fault of them because that's not necessarily what the market looks for yet, right? No one comes into Vasa and is like, hey man, like I'm really just want to like improve my executive function. I just want to improve my focus and my memory. I really want to think about my white matter down the road and really try to improve that. No one comes in and says that. It's about guns and buns and arms and abs, right? And people generally say they want to feel better, but there's no marketing towards everything above the neck. But when you look at the numbers, despite only being about 2% of our body weight, our brain accounts for 20 to 30% of the calories that we take in on a daily basis. So when you look at versus the amount of the size that it takes up versus the energy demand that it is, it's completely lopsided, right? So I said maybe there's a pea-brain approach to fitness. If we can start to market and think about attacking these things in our training programs, I think we can have a bigger impact, right? And realize there's also a whole subset of people who don't go to the gym because they're not really into their physical traits, but they're really into what goes on between their ears, right? So if you think there's a lot of people who could use what we have who don't want to come into this setting and don't think like, hey, this is a place for me, then we can have a bigger reach, right? And we're in the midst of a cognitive health crisis throughout the world. Cognitive diseases are the fastest growing diseases in the world right now. In fact, Alzheimer's, while we put a huge dent in a number of other diseases, all these major ones here, breast cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, stroke, HIV are all down. But Alzheimer's is up 89%. And that's not just because of the baby boomers. Throughout all populations going up, we're seeing a higher number of people showing up with Alzheimer's and dementia. Right? Okay, everybody stand up for a second. Find a group of 10. Like get into a group of 10 people here. Like find 10 people, and I want to see one leader from each group. You got 10 here? If we got an extra in a group, that's all right. If you got an extra, it's fine. Get as close to 10 as you can. You guys, group of 10 or something close? Each group, put one person from that group, put their hand up for me so I can see. How many groups we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Are you guys one group right here? That's fine. 10 or 11 is fine. Cool. All right. Now, let's do this. Let's say, let's pick one person from each group. Who's going to be the leader from each group? Put your hand up. Okay. All right, everybody else in the group, sit down.
You're about to give me a cognitive disease.
Yeah, so the chances are that these three people in here, or maybe one or two in a standard deviation either way, end up with dementia or Alzheimer's, right? Now let's pick one more person from the group. Stand up. Who else wants to stand up from their group? Okay, now these are the chances that somebody from this group ends up with clinical depression. Okay, so about 1 in 10 people end up with dementia or Alzheimer's. About 1 in 5 end up with clinically diagnosed depression. So two major cognitive diseases that are very popular in the news right now, especially with the recent suicide of Anthony Bourdain. I know a lot of people have been talking about clinical depression. Okay, so I just wanted to use that to drive a point home. But you guys can stay there if you want to sit on the floor, though. That doesn't matter to me. Okay. Currently, about 300 million people suffer from depression. U.S. population is about 325 million, just to put things into perspective there. Okay, 100 million of those people, about 1/3 don't respond to traditional treatment, so drugs, right? And then traditional therapy. 80% won't even seek a diagnosis. So that means even the 300 million that they guessed, probably that's an estimate, right? Because most people don't actually go and get treatment. Okay, and there's an estimated 1.3 million suicide attempts each year, and about 60% can be attributed to depression-related diseases, right? So again, cognitive diseases are throughout your entire population, where the people you're around every day, the people you work with, your own families, but most people don't reach out because you don't see the issue on the outside, right? And again, from a fitness standpoint, we don't actually look into thinking, hey man, I'm in a psychological business, and you really are. And Brett and Brendan did a great job talking about connections and communication. That's a huge piece of that. Because how many of you have clients that come to you solely because they literally, I'm this person's therapist, right? And you literally are. And everything you do, whether it's prescribing the exercise or communicating with them, is part of that. Okay? So I wanted to try to look at some of the science that's out there, try to open people's eyes to how valuable of a tool we have to be able to affect these things, right? So how can we battle cognitive decline? Again, like I said, you can't have a reactionary solution to a disease that's caused by lifestyle problems. Because by the time all those issues showed up, you've laid down a genetic pattern that's really hard to reverse. It's about preventative care. Okay? It's about coming in beforehand and doing the little things over time to try to prevent that breakdown from happening. Okay? So it's a multi-factor problem. It's not an easy question to answer, right? There's a lot of variables. If it was as easy as one thing, they could give you a pill, but it isn't. There's all these co-founding variables, right? Genetics, the amount of physical activity, your stress, your nutrition, your sleep, management of your blood sugar. These are all things I'm going to talk about today. And then in the practical, I'll give you some practical interactions to look at some of these things. Okay? So it's important to note that there is a genetic component to both the depression and Alzheimer's. Okay? They've recently identified a few genes. I know 23andMe did a project and a couple other researchers and did find genes for anxiety and depression, right? So if you were to go through that testing protocol, you can find that. We've known for a little while that ApoE4 is the genetic precursor that they look for if they're looking for likeliness of getting Alzheimer's or dementia. People who have ApoE4 are 4 times as likely to end up with a dementia-related disease, right? Now, it's important to remember one thing, right? I think you should do this. I do 23andMe. It's cheap, right? And I like to know that information. Some people don't want to know, right? And I didn't have a precursor, so if I get it, it's my own fault. It's not my parents' fault, right? But I think some people get so caught up in the word predisposition, they think they're destined. And there's a Sapolsky quote, or someone else, maybe it isn't Sapolsky, it's somebody else, right? And they say, genetics load the gun, but your environment pulls the trigger. Genetic predisposition isn't a life sentence, right? And I think that people are like, oh, I don't want to know. Well, no, I would want to know, because then I know what I'm up against. It's called a motivator, right? Right? So pick which trail you're going to go down. You want the red pill or the blue pill, right? And I'd rather know what I'm up against. So I encourage people to do testing and things like that to find that out. But again, that doesn't mean everyone that ends up with an ApoE4 gene or that depression gene ends up down that road, right?
I was just going to say, I know a lot of people in Utah have probably done the Ancestry.
Mhm.
I know that you can take your DNA information from Ancestry and plug it into 23andMe.
Yeah.
And Ancestry's tests are really cheap. They're like, I think they're on sale for Father's Day, like 60, 80 bucks.
Yeah, they're not that expensive at all. So I want to give that, kind of precursor first, telling people there is a genetic component, but realize that that's such a small piece. A gene, it's not worth saying what a gene codes for. It's worth saying what a gene codes for in a specific environment. Because we're environmental people. We set the environment for the people who come in here. So again, that's our ballpark. Okay? In that note, I think doing chronic blood testing is much more valuable. Right? And I use Inside Tracker. I think there's other companies. You can actually get, if you use the promo code movement, you actually get a discount. Okay, it's like 15% off. It's a pretty good deal. And what companies like this do is they'll do blood testing for you, looking at, inflammatory markers, looking at blood sugar, looking at breaking down your lipids, all these other things. And sometimes you go to the doctor and ask for these tests. They'll be like, oh, well, you're like 30 and healthy. What do you need that for? Because insurance would have to pay for it, right? In fact, I don't even really go to my general practitioner that often anymore. I just do this about every 6 months. And then I'll talk to other people who know about blood testing and make decisions based off that, right? And because I went to the doctor a year ago, and he was like, oh, you're like 29 and you're healthy. You could probably come back like 2 years or so. You're like, you don't have an issue. I'm like, you're supposed to be healthcare, not sick care, right? And I don't think it's that guy's fault, but that's the way the medical industry is set up. So again, I mentioned this in my talk last year, is that you need to set yourself up as a healthcare practitioner, because you're going to see the people way more than they see their doctor. Okay, literally, like what I think the stat was I said last year, that if you have a client who comes twice a week for a year and shows up 80% of the time, that's 100 touch points, not including text message and email, just face to face, right? And most people don't even see their doctor once a year, right? The average American. So think about it that way, okay? So again, using this so you can start to identify some of these things, and they give pretty good guidelines, most of these companies do, but then if you get this information, you can take it to another professional, people who do blood work, and get feedback, okay? But the current research, especially for Alzheimer's and dementia and depression, they've started to rename this thing as type 3 diabetes. And it's been pretty clear in the research is out there to show that it's a kind of uncontroversial link between uncontrolled blood sugar, inflammation, and depression and dementia. Okay, it's really interesting. So it can be complicated, but I figured this graphic would make it easier to understand. Okay, because I could try to use these words and make it really complicated, but half you guys wouldn't remember and I wouldn't understand, and probably neither would I. Okay, but just try to make it simple. In your brain, throughout your entire body, throughout plaque from head to toe, through all your arteries, you have this thing called insulin degrading enzyme, right? And when your blood sugar is all normal, right, it does a great job clearing out amyloid plaque. Amyloid plaque is the buildup in your brain that you get when you have dementia and Alzheimer's, right? And well, essentially, insulin-degrading enzyme just cleans stuff up. When there's plaque, things going through the arteries, whether it's in the brain or in the rest of the body, cleans things up. But when your insulin is really high, you have chronically elevated blood sugar, either just from eating really sugary things or just having too many calories in general, because that'll push your insulin up too. Just by the name, it has to have another priority. What does it have to do? It has to clear off insulin. So when you're continually clearing off insulin, cleaving off insulin, and getting rid of that, the amyloid plaque runs amok and builds up. And they found pretty clearly that if they watch that enzyme, with a second you jump the insulin off, it changes its job, right? So when you have people who are chronically overeating or chronically have high blood sugar, that allows amyloid plaque to run wild in the brain, and that's how you start to get tangles and all these things that are the root causes of things like dementia and depression. Okay. Also, this was really this was pretty amazing when I read it. Diabetes and depression occur together approximately twice as frequently as they would be predicted by chance alone. So more people have the two together than they do in isolation. Okay. Now you could say that that's associative, but then when I start to look at some more information in a second, you can see that it becomes causative. Okay. So they're starting to look at depression as an inflammatory disease. They don't think of it solely as a psychological disease. When they look at the blood markers in people who have depression, they're exactly the same as people who have chronic inflammation, chronic dementia, diabetes, diabetes, obesity disease, things like that. So people suffering from clinical diagnosed depression have higher concentrations of inflammatory biomarkers, C-reactive protein and IL-6. Those are two things you can get with your blood testing. But those are your two major inflammatory markers, cytokines that are in the blood. IL-6, if you get a cold or any sort of disease, immediately jumps up from your immune system, right? It's a classic inflammatory biomarker. And when you have things like that in your blood, a lot of other things go wrong. That's when things ache. That's when you start to see breakdown of cell and DNA replication. Okay? Major risk for impression increases by 44% for each standard deviation in C-reactive protein. So every time you get a jump in the data, there's a 44% increase in risk for clinical depression. Now these are associative, they're not causative, right? So these are when they looked at